Testing. This is Plan B. Some of us. It's tough when you have the first day on the job.
Charlie, this isn't first date for you. I can take the headset off. Okay, can you hear me now? Closer. Okay. Thank you, Charlie. I know that this is much more than I would be able to do, so I appreciate whatever help Charlie can give us. And I know we've had a couple of weeks where we've tried to get the wrinkles out, but I think next week I need to come in maybe a few minutes earlier to get this ironed out before we get taken off. So let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious Father, once again, we thank you that you brought us together, and I just ask that you would honor this time that we set aside. I pray that you would speak to our hearts, help us to gain understanding, help us to grow in our faith, minister to us as we look to you in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, as you can see from the projection, today we want to talk about Genesis and Gobekli Tepe, and I've subtitled this A Neolithic Beginning. Last week we got together, I introduced what is biblical archaeology all about. One of the things that I had said at that time is that the purpose of biblical archaeology is not necessarily to prove that the Bible is true, because there's many things that we cannot prove. You cannot prove actions, because back then we didn't have cameras or video. And even today, with our cameras and videos, still things are greatly disputed as to what transpired. But one of the things that biblical archaeology does is it confirms many of the details that we read in the scriptures. And so today we want to talk about something way back. Okay, we're going to go to the first book of the Bible. You probably recognize it as Genesis. And the first book of the Bible was written in the Hebrew language. And in the Hebrew language, it begins with these words: Bereshit bara Elohim. As a matter of fact, in Hebrew, the Jewish people refer to this book not as Genesis, but Bereshit, which means beginning. That has then been translated into the Greek language, Genesis, which we pronounce as Genesis, which means beginning. And the book of Genesis describes many beginnings: the beginning of the world, the beginning of people, the beginning of sin, the beginning of death, the beginning of God's covenant with us, and the beginning of the Jewish nation. It's the reason why we call this book Beginning. Perhaps we should even make it plural, beginnings. What I'm going to share with you is a discovery in southeastern Turkey that revealed one of those beginnings. As you can see from the map, this is, that is red, right? I'm colorblind. Okay. Southeastern Turkey, the dot there just above the border of Syria, not far from the Syrian border for that matter, a site that is known as Gobekli Tepe. In Turkish, the word Gobekli means pot belly. Tepe means hill, pot belly hill. And this is a site that is located between the Euphrates River and the Tigris River, what is called ancient Mesopotamia. And this site dates back to the earliest human habitation, the earliest known human settlement anywhere in the world, dating back to roughly 11,500 years ago. Let's take back to the beginning of the discovery. This discovery was made by a Kurdish shepherd as he was wandering about with his flock, and he discovered something like what you see in the foreground of this photograph. Strange markings on rocks in pits that may have been cisterns for water collection. He brought this to the attention of the German Archaeological Institute, And they sent out Klaus Schmidt to investigate the site. 1994. What he found were stones with unusual markings and cisterns. And as he began to excavate, he excavated for 10 years, kept it under wraps, didn't let others know about what was being unearthed, because he knew full well that this was a profound discovery that was going to impact how we understand prehistory, before any written language existed. What he discovered were stone monoliths, some as high as 20 feet in height, weighing somewhere between 7 and 10 tons, most of them with relief carvings on them, mostly of animals and a few people. I visited the site, I can't even tell you how many years ago. Today it's been covered with a shelter to protect it, of course, but this is a shot that I took before it was covered, and you can see some of the wrappings that the archaeologists have over the recent excavations, because once you excavate something, you expose it. And once you expose it, there's the prospect of damage from rain, from frost, from wind, and of course there's also the danger of people. One of the things that damages archaeological remains more than anything else is people. It's one of the reasons why this was not disclosed for about 10 years. There were circles of these monoliths. You can see some of these monoliths partially uncovered, and they supported a wooden roof, which has over the years collapsed, has not survived. Wood doesn't typically last for very long unless there's pristine conditions to aid the preservation. There were stone benches out and around some of these circular structures. Charlie, I'm held up on this one. There we go. There are stone floors, terrazzo floors. And they discovered more than 20 of these circles in the near proximity of Gobekli Tepe, in the surrounding areas. You can see this is a shot that I took several years ago where they began excavations at another one of these circles that they had discovered. And getting up closer, you can see as they take the earth down, begin excavations. Around the perimeter, you see what is called the balk. The balk, they preserve the balk so that they can examine the stratigraphy. We talked about stratigraphy last time we were together. The further you go down, the further you go back in history. And you can see another one of these monoliths as they are excavating and bringing the soil down. Here's an aerial shot. And the area off onto the right-hand side of the photograph is what has been primarily excavated, where most of the attention has been directed. You can see some of the other excavation sites off onto the right-hand or the left-hand side. What archaeologists do is they will excavate squares, and between the squares, of course, they leave approximately a 1 yard or 1 meter wall. That's the balk, and then they take it down. This is This is a drawing. What archaeologists do, again, in the process, is at various stages, they will photograph what is found in each of the squares, and they will also do drawings so that they're able to lay out, such as you see here, the artifacts that are discovered, where they're discovered in the site. If artifacts are removed, and many times artifacts are removed, because as you continue to dig down further below where the artifacts, you cannot leave that hanging in space naturally, but at least you know at what level of the stratigraphy you find the artifact as you remove it and go down deeper. In 1994, when Klaus Schmidt, under the direction of the German Institute of Archaeology, arrived at the site, he soon realized how important this site was. It didn't take him long. And in retrospect, he made this statement. He says, as soon as I got there and I saw the stones, I knew that if I didn't walk away immediately, I would be here for the rest of my life. In fact, he was there for the rest of his life. Klaus Schmidt passed away of a heart attack in 2014. So Lee Clare, again from the German Institute of Archaeology, is now conducting the excavations at the site. The picture that you see here is one of the central circles. Once again, you see two monoliths in the center which supported the wooden roof. Then you see the other monoliths out around the perimeter. And we'll talk more about this circle well, a little bit later in our discussions. But from this photograph, you can also see that there's much of the earth that stands between the two monoliths that needs to be removed. Today, there's a shelter covering the main, what is called a huyuk. Huyuk is a hill, an ancient hill. That's a Turkish term that they use. And for the tourists that are coming, they have a walkway that surrounds the excavation. So you can see at the very top, the walkway. And again, the shelter is intended to keep the rain, the frost, and some of the wind. It's actually open to the wind, but, well, they're doing what they can to protect the site. When I was there just 4 months ago, when I took this shot, there are a lot of people coming to Gobekli Tepe now. Not just Turkish people, but people from across the world, because this has been splashed across the media. Perhaps some of you have read articles about Gobekli Tepe. So at any rate, that's it. Once the discovery was made public, the top, that is the world's top Paleolithic and Neolithic scholars weighed in with their comments. So David Lewis Williams, professor of archaeology at Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg, made this statement: Gobekli Tepe is the most important archaeological site in the world. Wow. It's a pretty profound statement. Now, some people may want to argue with him about that, but still it's saying a lot about the importance of Gobekli Tepe. Ian Hodder from Stanford University said, Gobekli Tepe is unbelievably big and amazing at a ridiculously early date. Many people think that it changes everything. It overturns the whole apple cart. All of our theories were wrong. This is much, much earlier than Stonehenge, much, much earlier than the pyramids, much earlier than any other site that has been discovered for human occupation. And then Steve Mithen from Reading University says, Gobekli Tepe is too extraordinary for my mind to understand. Well, this is supposed to be one of the world's top scholars with regard to the Paleolithic period, and what he's just saying is that this blows my mind. And so this has kind of reset our understanding of the beginning of civilization. When was it that people first congregated together and set down roots to live? Okay, as you folks are probably familiar, okay, the theory that has existed, which is true, that we began as hunter-gatherers, that is wandering around, not really putting down tent stakes for permanent residences anywhere, wandering around, hunting for game, and gathering fruits and berries and whatever subsisting or anything that is consumable. And then at some point, people began to settle down and to plant crops and to domesticate livestock. And so Gobekli Tepe has reset that date, okay? This was constructed at a time when there is no written language and no metal tools. So one of the big questions is, how do you make these things with no metal tools? So the belief is that they probably used obsidian and slowly cut and chiseled these things. And then how do you erect these things? Not easy to determine. This is a video that I had taken just to give you a kind of a panorama glimpse of, this is just one of the sites, a central site, which itself contains several circles. How many of you watched the bird as it flew across? It's hard not to watch it. Okay, so the next question is, how do we interpret the remains at Gobekli Tepe? Now, last time we had gathered together, I had mentioned that we can err on two sides, saying too much and saying too little. That is, blowing things out of proportion or minimizing the significance of the discovery. And I think, we've last week gave you several examples of mistakes of that sort. So how then do we want to interpret these things? Since this is the earliest prehistorical settlement, we have no written sources, because this is before writing, okay? We have no written sources to contextualize the findings. We also, since this is an anomaly, this is the first of discoveries, we have nothing else to compare it with. So again, we're kind of scratching our heads trying to determine what exactly is the meaning and how do we interpret these things. So as a consequence, many of the interpretations are speculative, sometimes really crazy hypotheses, to other more plausible scenarios. So perhaps, if you're familiar with Gobekli Tepe, maybe you've seen this. Gobekli Tepe, alien contact. Okay? Well, if we don't know how to explain things, and if we discover something that is really complex and far beyond what we expected or would have expected of people, primitive people like this, how can you explain the sophistication of the construction and what we see at Gobekli Tepe? Well, it must be aliens. I don't think aliens had anything to do with it. Okay, others have interpreted the site in astronomical ways. We know that in ancient Mesopotamia, later in time, not this early, but later in time, if we go back to the time of the Assyrians, for instance, which are mentioned in the Bible, we know the Assyrians and the Babylonians were involved in astronomical observations. And what they did is they overlaid legitimate astronomical observations with theology and belief in the gods. They believed in these twinkling celestial bodies, the stars, the moon, the sun. They believed that all these things were deities. And when they overlaid astronomy with astrology, or with astronomy and theology, they came up with astrology, okay? And so some people have suggested that the figures that we see etched on these monoliths may be astrological figures. So they're looking at the zodiac or constellations and saying, oh yeah, this matches this constellation. This must be what it's all about. I don't think Gobekli Tepe has anything to do with astrology or the zodiac. Others are saying that this is a primitive solar calendar. And so here's a suggestion that someone has made. They looked at one of these monoliths and they come up with this interpretation, a lunar month of 29 or 30. How do you come up with that? 11 lunar months, you toss in 10 days, and then the summer solstice to equal 365 days. I think that's just fabricated. I think it's concocted. I don't think it has any legitimacy. Another interpretation, Gobekli Tepe and its potential connection to the Vedic culture. Does Gobekli Tepe reveal the origins of Hinduism? Again, these are kind of harebrained interpretations of Gobekli Tepe. Okay, let's look at what we do know, and that is, as I've already mentioned, Gobekli Tepe is located between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and the book Genesis describes the Garden of Eden. Okay, and we read this, starting in verse 10. A river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is Pishon. Nobody knows where the Pishon River is. It's never been identified. And the name of the second is Gihon. Again, nobody knows where the Gihon River is. But the next 2 we do know. The name of the third river is Tigris. It flows east of Assyria. And the 4th river is the Euphrates. Now, the Pishon and the Gihon may have been ancient tributaries that flowed into the Tigris and Euphrates. We don't know, really, okay? But the identification of the Tigris and the Euphrates seems to suggest that this is somewhere in the area where the Garden of Eden once existed. So not surprisingly, we have this reputable British newspaper, the Daily Mail, that says, "Do these mysterious stones mark the site of the Garden of Eden?" Well, my response to that would be, I don't think so. Okay? The Garden of Eden, in my mind, was a quasi-spiritual, quasi-physical realm in which God placed human beings. And in that realm, of course, the people could talk with God, they could sense God's presence. But once we sinned, we were kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And the cherubim was to guard it so that no one can enter in. So I don't think there's any physical space on earth that we can claim to be the Garden of Eden. Again, it's a physical, somewhat spiritual realm that has been cut off, that we are unable to enter into. But nonetheless, there does seem to be maybe some connection with what's going on with the book of Genesis. So what do we know? Okay, let's go back. This is the earliest settlement in the world, dated approximately 11,600 years ago. As I've already mentioned, we have megaliths in the range of 18 to 20 feet in height, weighing 7 to 10 tons. Now the question is, how did they cut and erect the monoliths? Ancient people without the technology that we possess, without the tools that we possess, without the scientific understanding that we have today. It also predates written language, pottery. People didn't even make pottery back in those days. Pottery was developed a little bit later. Last week we talked about pottery helps us to date things, right? Well, there's no pottery, okay? And so what do these images, these reliefs that we see, what do they represent? What do they mean? So here is I got this off the internet, okay? Somebody suggesting how these people are propping it up. I think you need to tell the guy over on the left-hand side to get off the stone. But again, just a representation of how these people, who knows how, but somehow they created these things and established them. Continuing on, as I've already mentioned, Gobekli Tepe marks the transition from hunter-gatherers to settled civilization. It resets what scholars call the zero time, 0 point in time. Now, we also know that the area surrounding Gobekli Tepe is where agriculture and the domestication of animals first began. I think that's an important clue. Paleobotanists. These are botanists who study ancient seeds. Seeds actually last a while, okay? But paleobotanists who have engaged in these studies have determined that wild einkorn wheat and emmer wheat, along with barley, were first cultivated in this area. And so you can see the schematic here. You can see the shaded area, the darker area, the lighter area, where each of those different grain products were first cultivated in the world. And if you are able to see, let me see if I can zoom in to show you. Can you see Gobekli Tepe right there? Right in the middle? It overlaps where these grain products were first sown and cultivated. Now we put that together with livestock, and when livestock was first domesticated. So you can see in yellow, cattle was domesticated about 10,000 years ago in that area where we have that yellow circle. Pigs, help me with the color on that. What is it? Red. Pigs were first domesticated in that area about 10,500 years ago. Sheep, looks like that's a blue, 11,000 years ago. And then goats, is that an orange? Hey, that's a good guess, okay? And Gobekli Tepe, right there. Okay, so the fact that we have not only an obscenely early date for Gobekli Tepe, but that early date also corresponds with when people first were sowing grain into the soil. People don't sow grain into the soil and then move. You know, so this is not an indication of hunter-gatherers. Instead, these are people who are sinking their roots down into the soil. And the same thing is true for the domestication of livestock. You don't raise these, or I guess the word isn't cultivate so much. You don't gather these flocks together and then abandon them. And so again, it lends credence to the theory that this is where it all began. In the general vicinity of Gobekli Tepe, several stone heads were discovered. You can see 14 of them here, representations of some of the probably early humans who had populated this area. A couple of other interesting details, okay? In the year 2018, looks like 6 years ago, they discovered some incised skulls that had cuts in them that were not determined to be the cause of death. In other words, these were decorative cuts. And so as a consequence, many people are suggesting that perhaps these skulls were actually displayed at Gobekli Tepe. Okay? What could that indicate? Could that indicate ancestor worship? Perhaps. Okay? Again, we don't know exactly what the meaning of that is, but it's interesting that we have skulls of deceased individuals with these decorative cuts in them. Another interesting feature is Gobekli Tepe was abandoned around 8,000 BC. So we had an occupation period between 9,500 BC and 8,000 BC. And then for unknown reasons, the people who dwelt there left and relocated. Why, we don't know. It could be that they were invaded by others. It could be that they were killed by others. Remember, back in those days, it's kind of like dog eat dog. People were competing for resources, for food, for water, things of that sort. And it could be that the people who dwelt there were raided by others and consequently were killed. Schmidt originally believed that the people had buried the site, intentionally buried the site, and then departed. Okay? Today, that's not the theory that most scholars pursue. Most scholars today say, look, there's actually strata in the fill that has filled up eventually the site of Gobekli Tepe. So since there's strata, that tells us that it happened slowly and progressively over a period of time rather than all at once. Okay, so nobody today really believes that it was quickly covered up, because what Klaus Schmidt was basically saying is that this was a religious site, this was an early temple, and I think that theory has a lot of legitimacy to it. But then for some unknown reason, they left the site but covered up the worship site. Okay, nobody believes that. Instead, it seems that after the people departed, then the site slowly filled up on its own. Okay, since the discovery of Gobekli Tepe some 30 years ago, 2 other sites have been discovered a little bit to the southeast of Gobekli Tepe. One of them is called Karahan Tepe, which is even closer to the Syrian border. In fact, it's not far from Haran. How many of you are familiar with Haran? Haran is mentioned in the book of Genesis. It is where Abraham migrated. You see, Abraham migrated from this very area that we're talking about, okay, and then when God called him, he went from the southeastern part of Mesopotamia up to the northwestern part of Mesopotamia and settled in Haran, and then spent a great deal of time in Haran before God called him then to go to Canaan. Okay, so Karahan Tepe is not far from Haran. And then Bon Chuklu Tarla was discovered a little bit further to the east of this. And again, these 2 sites are similar in some regards. Actually, Karahan Tepe is much more similar to Gobekli Tepe because it also has some of these T-shaped monoliths, whereas Bon Chuklu Tarla does not have them, but still it's a very early site. And these 2 sites also seem to be dated about the same time, or perhaps even slightly earlier than Gobekli Tepe. Of course, the archaeologists all are jockeying for the honor. We're earlier. Well, who knows, really? You know, this is so early that it's difficult to date. And so, at any rate, there's 2 sites aside from Gobekli Tepe that are similar to what we see there. So, plausible interpretations of the finds. What do we have here? As I mentioned, Schmidt declared that Gobekli Tepe was an ancient temple complex. He claims that it's the earliest temple anywhere in the world. Well, naturally, if it's the first settled site, then it would also be the first ancient temple complex. He says this is where hunter-gatherers first assembled for religious and cultic purposes. These were the world's first temple. But it's interesting because Schmidt said there's no evidence that this was a residential complex, which is kind of puzzling. So they build this and then wander all over the place and come back. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Well, since then, research that has been conducted at Gobekli Tepe, one of the things that they discovered were stone tools like obsidian. So this helps us to understand how they made some of these things. It would have taken a lot of time. They discovered butchered animal bones, which indicates that animals were killed here and consumed here. Charcoal, which indicates that there were fires here. They were cooking the meat of these animals that they had captured. And there's also plant food remains, grinding stones. All of these suggest that Gobekli Tepe was a human residential site. Not just a temple site, but also a place where the people lived. Today, this is, again, a schematic similar to what I had shown you earlier. Help me with the color. Is that yellow? Okay. See, dark, you know, if you see on the left-hand side and up on the top of the screen, everything, really bright green sometimes looks yellow to me, so I don't want to go out on a limb too far. But those are now thought to be residences, small little single room places where people were dwelling some 1,100 years ago, 11,000 years ago. So that theory has changed. Now, continuing, what are the theories? Lee Clare, who I mentioned had taken over the excavations, was assigned by the German Institute of Archeology after Klaus Schmidt had passed away. He questions the hypothesis that Gobekli Tepe was a temple site. But I think, again, here's a guy who's minimizing. Remember, we talk about errors in various directions. I think he's minimizing the evidence that we have at Gobekli Tepe. Instead, he says that Gobekli Tepe was a place for social gatherings and expressions of local traditions. What kind of local traditions? Others are saying that Gobekli Tepe depicts an origin myth. That is how the world and the people came to be. But how can you have an origin myth without postulating or suggesting that there's a God? Just some shots that I've taken to zero in. You can see on the monolith that's in the foreground a large creature thought to be perhaps a lizard. Then in the monolith that's behind it a little bit, you see in high relief a creature that we cannot identify. We don't know what it is. Okay, then below it, that's easy to identify. That's a boar. Another monolith up at the top. We don't know what those creatures are. Some people would suggest that they may be kangaroos. Others suggest maybe they are geese. It's hard to say. Okay, below them, of course, you can see another. Does it help if I zoom in? You guys can see this okay? Again, that's a boar. And then below the boar, you can see there's still excavation that needs to be done. Not sure what that animal might be. Perhaps even a fox. Difficult to say. Another monolith, if we zoom in. Some people have identified those objects up at the top of the monolith as being baskets, and there's been some strange attempts to describe those baskets because you can see in those baskets you have creatures going into those baskets. So for instance, on the right-hand side, you can see a frog that's being stuffed into the basket, a lizard being stuffed into the basket in the middle, and on the left-hand side, it looks like a bird being stuffed into the basket. What is that? I don't know. Others have suggested that those baskets represent the monoliths, or the circles. As I mentioned, the 20 circles that you can see out and around the site. Or further below, it looks like a bird of some sort with a hooked beak, perhaps a hawk. Further below, that looks like a scorpion. And then, what's that at the very bottom? Another bird with a long-necked bird of some sort. Excavations have taken the earth down a little bit further. You can see that there is an opening. And you can see there's a bull represented at the top of the opening. And then on the left-hand side and also on the right-hand side, it looks like, again, two creatures. Could they be a fox? Could they be lizards? Hard to say. And then, again, we've got a monolith with snakes. More snakes. And then I want to direct your attention over to the left-hand side of the screen. Let's move it over there. Another one of my videos. And like I say, this is one of the central monoliths. You see two monoliths, again, surrounded by monoliths. You can see benches on the sides, so we know that people were sitting there looking towards the inside, the interior. All of this lends support to the belief that this was a temple site. But what do you notice on the monolith? You see, again, probably a lizard, but what's next to the lizard? Can anybody make a suggestion as to what is that? Let's go to another picture. You can actually see it on both of these two central monoliths. I'm going to zoom in. What is it? Can you see? An arm with fingers. Many people think that this is a representation of God reaching down to mankind, to people. The belief that God is interactive. God isn't just out there where the stars are, the sun, moon, and the planets, but that God is interactive in what's going on here on earth. Another shot. So let's wrap this together, wrap it up. Gobekli Tepe marks the transition from hunter-gatherers to settled civilization. That's pretty clear. I think everybody can concur and agree with that. And this really takes us back to some of what we read about in the book of Genesis. You may remember that Adam and Eve had two sons, Cain and Abel. Cain slew Abel, right? And as his punishment, he was banished to a life of travel. Looking at Genesis chapter 4, verse 12, you shall be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. And at some point, of course, people stopped wandering and settled. Now, this is where it becomes important for us, and this is where the scholars, the Neolithic scholars have said this is what really resets our understanding of what's going on. Previously, sociologists who have studied antiquity believe that our belief in God is a byproduct of domesticated civilizations, of settlements. That people, once they gathered together, began to talk among one another, and they had idle time when they speculated on origins. How did we come to be? How did this world come to be? Okay, so sociologists have long suggested that human beings created a belief in God. Okay, they created a belief in God. Gobekli Tepe tells us that a belief in God existed before people were settled. And that's important because it corresponds with what we read about in Scripture. Scripture tells us that a belief in God is embedded in our conscience. This is what Romans chapter 2 is all about. That when God created us, He created us unlike the animals of this world, unlike plants. We have a mind, okay? We have a physical component to our being, that is a body. We have a spiritual component. We have a soul and a spirit, okay? The soul is the immaterial aspect of our being, but the spirit is something that is, again, immaterial, but it is something that animals do not have. And that is the capacity, the ability to commune with God, to understand that there is a God, okay? And that is how God created us from the very beginning. That's why, how do we know what's right or wrong? If you look at animals, animals will steal from others. Animals will kill without conscience. If we do those things, it's that spirit that tells us this is wrong. How do we know that it's wrong? It's because God is speaking and working through conscience to tell us and to give us some kind of a basic understanding of rights and wrongs. Gobekli Tepe demonstrates that a belief in God preceded civilizations. And so not only is it conscience that tells us of the existence of God, but also creation tells us of the existence of God. Creation is so complicated that this is, if I could interject a little bit of my personal testimony here, I did not come from a Christian family. I came from a family whose parents never went to church. And I went to Penn State. I majored in biology. And I concentrated on genetics, which are the building blocks of evolutionary theory. And studying sciences, okay? As I took classes in many different sciences along with the biology, I came to the conclusion that it couldn't happen that way. It's impossible. So then, that began my journey to discover, is there a God? And just to shorten the story, at the end of that discovery, I came to conclude that there is a God. And I came to conclude that the God reflected in the Bible is the God who created this world. Now, there's much more to that story that I can leave for another time. But what Romans chapter 1, verse 20 says, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. And of course, we also have Psalm 19, the first verse. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. So I like hiking. Many of you know that I spend a lot of time out in Turkey, and many times I'm out in nature by myself, and there's nothing that speaks to me about the existence of God more than seeing the beauty of creation. So we're 8 minutes before 7 o'clock, I see, and I'll just open it up to questions.
The monoliths, are these all have been brought back up, or were they as
No,
they were?
many of them were still standing and erect. Some of them had collapsed, but many of them were erect. That's why you can see the one photograph that I showed you a little bit earlier. As they began to take the earth down, you can see the top of it. So that's still erect. So, and some of them were broken, as you can imagine. How many of these things are going to survive for, well, 11,000 years?
I have a question, Mark, about the stone pillars that are shaped like a T.
Yeah, roughly like a T.
So two questions. Number one, is that unique to this area of the world, that they would be shaped like that? And number two, why do you think they're shaped that way?
We don't know why they're shaped that way. Perhaps to broaden the top to support a roof a little bit better. That would be my suggestion. Karahan Tepe also has T-shaped monoliths like this. I mentioned Karahan Tepe, which is located not far from Haran. But other than that, I'm not aware of any T-shaped monoliths that resemble these in any way.
Concerning having everything we've seen here in the pictures, is anything underneath any of that? Have they stopped?
No, they have not stopped excavating. If I were to go back several photographs, you can see that there are still areas, even in the center. Where can I go back? Even in the central sections, you can see right here, for instance. Well, we're off. I thought we still had our screen. That's okay. There's still much to be excavated, so there's still much more that's going to be discovered. I would say at the circles that have been excavated since the T-shaped monoliths stick up highest, those have probably been exposed. What's going to be discovered down below? Who knows? The excavation process takes a long time because the archaeologists are tedious in the removing of the earth. It's a very slow process, very costly process. And I might also mention that of the 20, there's more than 20 of these circles that have been discovered with what is called ground-penetrating radar. They've got a machine that looks, well, let's call it a lawnmower. It's not. It looks something like that they can roll over the soil, and it throws radar down below the soil, and depending upon what's beneath, it can penetrate as many as like 20 feet down. Okay, if it's stone, that is much more dense, and so it blocks, and as a consequence, you can see that there's stone down there. You can get an idea what's underneath the soil. And so they have discovered, as I mentioned, a little more than 20 of these circular temple sites at Gobekli Tepe. Most of them have not been excavated. You can see from that aerial shot that I'd shown a little bit earlier. Here we go. You can see from the aerial shot that they've got maybe 4 or 5 of them to date that they're working on.
What formed the basis for any kind of accuracy dating the site? You didn't mention that they found any organic material until you started talking about the other 2 towns south of there. So what were they using to date the site?
It may be the seeds. They have found seeds. They have found animal bones. Remember I'd mentioned that we know that these people had slaughtered animals and were consuming animals. So you can do a little bit of carbon dating there. And I'm not familiar with all, I can't date things back to the Neolithic period myself, of course, but maybe they have other ways of dating aside from carbon dating. Yeah, they're charred remains. I can't detail what all charred remains there are. But Mark, when you mention Mesa Verde, maybe you can come up with a theory that Mesa Verde people had flown over to Gobekli Tepe and had established the site. We have bizarre theories. I'm just chiding.
That's a great idea. I should love that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, people are throwing out some crazy thoughts on Gobekli Tepe.
How do you personally justify this timeline of how old it is? What do you think of that timeline?
Yeah.
I don't believe in millions of years, but your dating goes way back further than I think it does.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not a young Earth creationist. There are some people who believe that the Earth was created 8,000 years ago. Okay, and this goes back to, well, actually, Bishop Ussher, when he dated the King James Bible, for instance, there's actually a date of October something or other, 4000 BC. Okay, and he made the mistake of assuming that all of the genealogies in the book of Revelation depict father-son relationships. And that's probably not the case, okay? There's probably gaps. In other words, there are patriarchs that are mentioned in the Genesis narratives. Now, the reason we know that is we have discovered ancient Mesopotamian tablets that have what is called a colophon. Okay, the colophon would be, the tablet itself, written in cuneiform, and I don't know cuneiform, but scholars do, and it tells the outstanding deeds of this king. It tells about this civilization, the civilization at Akkad or Assur. And then at the very end, it has a colophon. The colophon, of course, gives information about where this tradition was passed down from generation to generation, okay? And so scholars believe that those genealogies in the book of Revelation, or the book of Genesis, are a collection of colophons. That is records, family records that have been passed down through time, okay? So I can get into a lot of hot water here with regard to my speculations, my personal beliefs with regard to creation. I don't believe that the world is billions of years old. I do not believe that the world came into existence atheistically. But I do believe there was a point of creation, okay? The 6 creative days do not necessarily indicate a 24-hour period of time. In Hebrew, the word for day is yom, and yom can also be translated as an epoch, a period of time. And so there may be extended periods of time in between the 6 creative days. When I was at Penn State, one of the classes that I took was a class in geology. And in geology, they trotted out the fossil record, right? You've all seen this, right? Where we morph from amoebas all the way up to fish and reptiles and mammals and apes and finally to humans, right? And that's the theory that's promoted in colleges, universities, high schools all across America. But when that theory was first proposed by Darwin some 200 years ago, Darwin fully expected that as archaeological research and discoveries were made, that we would fill in the gaps, right? Today we use the term the missing link as if it were singular. The fact of the matter is there's thousands upon thousands of missing links. And even though there have been tremendous discoveries of fossils of various sorts, we still don't find missing links. What we find are clumps. We'll find a clump of species, and we have many fossils of a different species, and then we'll have another species, which supposedly is what we morphed into, or what evolved into, but we don't find the gaps, okay? And, you know, that's one of the things that my geology professors and biology professors had an awkward time trying to explain. Why don't we have the gaps? As a consequence, that's what led me to search. Did this world come into being atheistically, or is there a God? And so I do believe that there was a point of creation. I don't think it's recent, somewhere in the order of, like as some people would suggest, 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago. I don't think that, because I think there's enough evidence to indicate that it's older than that. But that's where I stand. I mean, you can believe, there's some people who believe in what is called theistic evolution, okay? And some people believe that God used evolutionary process. God was tinkering at a genetic level. I mean, you can be a Christian and believe in theistic evolution. I just don't think that God was tinkering at a genetic level, and it took billions of years to bring about the complexity that we see in the world today. For me, that's the reason why I am not a theistic evolutionist. Instead, I do believe that there was a creation, a point in time, perhaps several points in time, where God created. But the thing is, the book of Genesis tells us who, not how. Remember the first 3 words that I started this with. Book of Genesis begins with the words Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. You put me on the spot. Well, thank you. You folks have been kind. You haven't thrown tomatoes at me yet, so I appreciate that. And we'll get together next week. And next week, let's talk about the Black Sea and the flood. Would that be interesting? We'll see you then. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what can I say? What I will say is question and answer period is over, Jane.